Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 846, and today is October 16th, 2025. I'm the host of the show, Kyle Anzalone. A lot of news to get into on today's show, going to be breaking it all down. I do a lot of different things. I host the Kyle Anzalone Show, Conflicts of Interest, and I write articles for antiwar.com, the Libertarian Institute, and judgenap.com. So you can either go to all those places to find my work, or I do post everything on my Twitter handle at @KyleAnzalone_. We are still just, I think, 25 followers away from 10,000. So if you help me hit that target, that would be great. If you already follow me, recommend that other people follow me on ads, and that could help me to hit that goal. All right, getting into the news here on today's show. This first story from Dave DeCamp, October 15th, antiwar.com. Report at least one U.S. strike on boat in the Caribbean targeted Colombians. So, according to CNN, at least one of the U.S. military strikes on the boats in the Caribbean over the past month and a half targeted Colombian nationals, citing two people briefed by the Pentagon. The report said that the U.S. strike in the region on September 19th targeted a boat that left Colombia. In a statement on the bombing, which marked the third vessel in the region, Trump claimed without evidence that the boat was carrying drugs and killed 3 narco-terrorists. He said the attack was carried out in the U.S. Southern Command's area of responsibility, which includes the Caribbean and South America. Notably, the September 19th strike was the only time that Trump announced the bombing of the boat in the region and didn't mention Venezuela. The CNN report said the boat was suspected of carrying Colombians affiliated with Colombian terrorist organizations, but the Pentagon was unable to determine the identities of each person on the boats before they struck them. The lack of identification suggests the War Department doesn't have the evidence to back up its claims about who was targeting in the Caribbean. According to a report from the Associated Press, the Pentagon hasn't provided Congress with any hard evidence to support its allegations of the vessels being bombed. And so these are pretty clearly extrajudicial strikes. It's notable that one of these boats was carrying Colombian nationals, and they all weren't people who had left and departed from Venezuela. But at the same time, I don't think this really takes away from the fact that we should be very worried about regime change coming up here in Venezuela. This article I wrote for JudgeNap.com on October 15th. Trump orders CIA to conduct lethal covert operations in Venezuela. And so this is a New York Times story where they say the Trump has authorized, and Trump later confirmed this, so this isn't necessarily like any kind of controversial. This is only being reported because the mainstream media hates Trump. Trump verified this, and I do think it was an official and intentional leak. So we could talk about that more in a minute. But the story says that Trump has signed off on the CIA conducting lethal operations inside of Venezuela, and those would target Maduro and his government. So this is pretty clearly meant to be a threat towards Maduro, if not an order to go ahead and try to assassinate the Venezuelan leader. Now, I was talking to Dave DeCamp about this yesterday, just in a private conversation, but I'm sure he wouldn't mind sharing this because I think it was a really important insight that this being an official leak, it may be that this isn't necessarily Trump really trying to ramp up the U.S. military operations in Venezuela, but rather meant to be a threat to try to intimidate Maduro to just give up power. Another example of this is another story I wrote yesterday for JudgeNap.com. U.S. flies B-52 bomber near Venezuela. So 3 B-52 bombers, I believe on Tuesday, left Louisiana and made a mock bombing run towards Venezuela before turning around just outside of Venezuelan waters and flying back to Louisiana. I haven't seen an official statement from the Trump administration on this, but the flights were tracked on radar, so people definitely know they happened. And again, it seems like this is just meant to be a threat to try to get Maduro to leave power. My guess is that the B-52s really don't need to make a mock bombing run towards Venezuela to be prepared to hit Venezuela. And so this would suggest there's a pretty intense like psychological war going on against Maduro in the Trump White House. They broke off talks with him. There's no negotiations going on. Maduro apparently offered to let the U.S. have access to Venezuelan minerals and oil, and that wasn't even good enough for the Trump administration. So it does seem like we're gearing up for a regime change operation in Venezuela. I think Trump would prefer that Maduro just leave power, of course, and he's willing to take some steps like, these intimidation measures to try to make that happen. I'm not sure if it's actually going to be enough to get Maduro to leave power, just flying some B-52s near the Venezuelan border, saying that we signed off on lethal CIA operations in Venezuela. He's been in power for a long time, so I'm guessing he's going to hold on to this. What I think this means is we're probably still a couple months away from an all-out war between the U.S. or any kind of real effort to go after Maduro's government in Venezuela. An all-out war may be too strong of a way to frame it, but my guess is that over the next couple of months, the Trump administration is going to ramp up this PR campaign and psychological war for really two reasons. One, they would prefer that Maduro just leave power and hand it over to whoever they prefer. I guess it's that Marina Machado lady who just won the Nobel Peace Prize. And so that, that's what they're hoping for. But when that doesn't happen, a second kind of effect of this is it's ramping the American people, it's gearing the American people up for war with Venezuela, which I do think they would like to have happen. And so I think we're going to continue to see the strikes on boats in the Caribbean, maybe an escalation to strikes against narco-terrorist groups inside of Venezuela, before eventually we get to just outright strikes and CIA operations against the Venezuelan government. Moving on here to some news about Ukraine. Kiel Institute, sharp decrease in Western support for Ukraine in July and August. A new report from the Kiel Institute reveals that a significant decline in military aid to Ukraine during July and August. Under President Donald Trump, the U.S. has halted military assistance to Ukraine, and European assistance for Kiev has also dipped. So the Kiel Institute explained, after the U.S. stopped announcing new aid packages at the beginning of 2025, European countries stepped in and significantly expanded their military support. However, this momentum collapsed in the summer. Military allocations from European countries fell by 57% compared to January through June of 2025. President Donald Trump has criticized Joe Biden's policy of providing Ukraine with over $100 billion in aid and weapons. The president has cut arms transfers to Ukraine, but has encouraged Europe to buy American weapons for Kiev. Most of the military aid going to Ukraine is now through the NATO PURL, or Plural Initiative. Under the program, European countries fund U.S. arms sales to Ukraine. While Plural was intended to replace the American aid to Ukraine, the Kiel Institute said it's only making up a small portion of what was provided to Kiev under President Joe Biden. When their contributions to the NATO Plural Initiative were included in the monthly averages of all military aid to Ukraine during this period, was 43% below the level of the first half of 2025, the Kiel Institute explained. So, this isn't making up the difference. And everybody saw this coming, and we've been talking about this on the show for months. The Kiel Institute is a fairly mainstream German think tank that's pro-Ukraine. So this isn't some kind of Russian misinformation. I just think it's important that the Kiel Institute is saying this, that it kind of backs up what we've been saying over the past few months on this show. So while Trump has cut military aid to Ukraine, he has stepped up support for Kiev and other areas. The Financial Times revealed that the U.S. is now helping Ukraine to plan attacks on Russian energy sites far from the front lines. Additionally, Trump has stepped up the economic war against Russia and is threatening massive tariffs on Moscow's trading partners. NATO defense ministers met on Wednesday to find a solution to the lack of arms flowing to Ukraine. I didn't see a major announcement, so I'm guessing they're having some real trouble coming up and filling the gap left that Joe Biden just provided an insane amount to Ukraine left. All right, next up here, another very concerning story about Europe. NATO looking for more flexible rules of engagement with Russia. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization is considering easing rules on the use of force against Russia. Russia is accused of violating Estonian, Polish, and Romanian airspace in September. So Sky TG24, an Italian news outlet, like a mainstream channel, said NATO leaders are seeking more flexibility in engaging Russia on the bloc's eastern flank. So the report explains NATO Commander-in-Chief U.S. General Alexis Grenkiewicz has asked for allies for more flexibility in the rules of engagement to better manage the defense of the eastern flank, especially in light of the launch of Operation Sentry East, which is a test bed for the development of integrated air defense operations. Some members of NATO are seeking to ease or remove national limitations on that countries impose on military equipment under NATO command. And so, say the U.S., Italy, and Spain all deploy fighter jets to Lithuania as under NATO's command. NATO cannot just order those jets to do whatever NATO wants. The United States could say, we don't want our jets involved in interceptions. The Italians could say, we only want our jets involved in interceptions that they violate airspace so much. The Spanish may say, you could do whatever the hell you want with our aircraft. We don't even care. And so this is kind of the situation that NATO faces. Something similar happened during the Afghan war, where you had the NATO command centers. And I want to say Stanley McChrystal talked about this, but I've certainly heard this from multiple different people who are deeply involved in the Afghan war. Stanley McChrystal was a U.S. general who ran the war for a short period of time under Barack Obama. But basically, they had this NATO command center, and you had 28 different countries in that command center, right? And let's say one country was only willing to do counter-narcotic operations. Another country wasn't willing to engage at all in counter-narcotic operations. Some countries were willing to engage the Taliban, maybe only using aerial operations, while others only ground operations. Some countries were willing to engage in certain areas of Afghanistan and others. And so this creates like a real puzzle and mess and problem. Now, I don't like this solution. I think this solution is going to take us closer to war with Russia. I just want to point out the kind of problem that NATO is trying to resolve here. So the discussions follow Russian alleged violations of NATO airspace last month. Tallinn claimed 3 Russian jets flew in Estonian airspace over the Gulf of Finland. NATO said the jets remained in Estonian territory for about 12 minutes, and the bloc scrambled F-35s operated by Italy to escort the Russian warplanes. The Kremlin has denied that allegation. In a separate incident, about 24 Russian decoy drones entered Polish airspace. The bloc scrambled multiple fighter jets and shot down some of the UAVs. The operations cost the bloc about $500 million. Russia has denied that it targeted Poland, and Belarus claims that the drones flew into Polish airspace after they were impacted by Ukrainian electronic interference. In a third event, a Russian drone entered Romanian airspace before turning around and striking Ukraine. Trump and NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte have called for shooting down Russian aircraft in Allied airspace. And so certainly this is a concern of the kind of escalating conflict going on between NATO, the U.S., and Russia. This article I wrote for the Libertarian Institute on October 15th. Treasury Sec threatens the world decoupling from China over Beijing's rare earth export restrictions. So, two top Treasury Department officials blasted China over its export ban on rare earth minerals and threatened that the U.S. may decouple in response. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent stated that Washington sought to avoid escalating the trade war with Beijing. At a presser on Wednesday, Trade Representative Jasmine Greer told reporters that Beijing's new restrictions on exporting rare earths are a global supply chain power grab. Bessent added that the restrictions could cause countries to end their trade relationship with China. So Bessent said, not only is China fueling Russia's war in Ukraine, but China's actions have also once again demonstrated the risk of being dependent on them on rare earths, and for that matter, anything. If China wants to be an unreliable partner to the world will have to decouple. On Tuesday, China expanded export controls on rare earths. Currently, China restricts the export of 12 of the 17 rare earth elements. Additionally, China placed more scrutiny on the semiconductor trade. Approximately 90% of the world's rare earth minerals and magnets are produced in China. Rare earths are essential in electronic vehicles, smartphones, and other tech products. Bessent said that there was a path to avoid escalating the trade war with China, and that Trump still planned to meet with Chinese President Xi later this week. He told reporters, "We don't want to decouple from China." He added, "There has been many outreaches to the Chinese delegation. We are working on a meeting. President Trump is a go on the meeting with Xi. Trust between Trump and Xi is the reason this hasn't escalated." And Trump has threatened to place, I believe, 100% tariffs on China over the export ban. And so it seems we're really on the brink of this trade war ramping up. We will see what happens when Trump meets with Xi tomorrow. I believe that meeting is supposed to take place in South Korea. Next up here, moving over to the Middle East. Kamala Harris, we should ask if Israel committed genocide in Gaza. So former Vice President Kamala Harris said we should all ask if Israel committed a genocide in Gaza. She made the remarks after serving in the administration that funded and armed the Israeli military to slaughter civilians. On MSNBC's This Weekend, Harris was asked by Eugene Daniels, "A lot of folks in your party have called what is happening in Gaza a genocide. Do you agree with that?" She said we should all ask the question, but refused to answer, saying that's for the courts to decide. So this is Harris's response. "Listen, it is a term of law that a court will decide. But I will tell you that when you look at the number of children that have been killed, the number of innocent civilians that have been killed, the refusal to give aid and support, we should all step back and ask this question and be honest about it. Yeah." So, unsurprisingly, Kamala Harris-like answer from that question. So while Harris presented herself as unqualified to make a determination on genocide, she is a lawyer who served as a district attorney and attorney general of California. So it seems unbelievable that this woman is unwilling or unable, maybe she is unable, I don't know, to read the international law and what it says on genocide, what it means to conduct a genocide. She should have, she was the vice president after all, pretty good insight to what Israel was and is doing in Gaza, and then to be able to take the law, take the facts, and make a determination. That's what somebody with a law degree should be capable of doing. Now, Kamala Harris, as we all know, is an idiot, possibly has maybe a drinking or pharmaceutical drug that she really likes, and so she's kind of loopy and silly and unfocused most of the time, and maybe she just simply can't sit down and read and understand. I don't know, but it just seems unexcusable to me that somebody who, again, is a lawyer, a former attorney general, would not be able to weigh in on this issue and say, you know, this is the relevant law, these are the provisions, and this is why, or why not. You know, she could have even argued that this is what the law said, and this is why what Israel is doing doesn't amount to a genocide. That would have at least been a more honest answer and more thorough answer than what she said. But I have no idea. I can't determine that. What All right, so according to the Gaza Health Ministry, at least 67,000 Palestinians have been killed by the Israeli onslaught. The likely death toll is significantly higher, as it does not count as deaths and Palestinians who were killed by Israelis, but whose bodies were not recovered. Data from the Israeli military shows at least 83% of the dead are innocent civilians. Israel has prevented enough food from entering Gaza, creating a famine. Hundreds of Palestinians have starved to death. Israel's genocide in Gaza began while Harris was serving as Biden's vice president. While Biden and Harris were criticized by their base over their support for Israel's destruction of Gaza, the White House refused to pressure Tel Aviv to end the assault. And it's important, and Anthony Blinken has said this, that the deal that was just agreed to by Hamas and Israel is something that was proposed and Hamas agreed to last year in, I believe, September of 2024. And so, Harris was in a position, along with Joe Biden, to pressure Israel into accepting the ceasefire when they were in office and didn't do so, right? This is just inexcusable. So Biden was dubbed Genocide Joe and Kamala Holocaust Harris. While running for president in 2024, the two were often heckled by left-wing activists over their support for the Israeli genocide. A poll released earlier this year found that Harris's refusal to diverge from Biden's Israel policy was the most common reason why Americans who voted for Biden in 2020 did not vote for Harris in 2024. Simply put, this issue cost this woman the election, and she still doesn't have the courage to call it a genocide. What a disgusting and idiotic person. All right. Next up here, let's talk about what's actually happening in Gaza. Israeli forces continue to kill Palestinians in Gaza despite ceasefire. Israeli forces continue to kill Palestinians in Gaza on Wednesday despite the ceasefire deal that was signed last week, as Israel has issued warning against approaching the yellow line, referring to the line that Israeli troops drew when they went into a truce into effect on Friday. Now, it's important to note that this line, at least as far as I could tell, is not spray painted on the ground. They didn't put up cones or barriers or signs or anything like that. It's just a line that's on a map. Now, typically put lines on map are drawn much thicker than they would actually exist on the ground. And so while the map looks, fairly narrow, the line looks narrow on the map, when it actually comes to imposing it on the ground, there's probably a pretty significant area in where the actual line could be. And so maybe Palestinians who are trying to return to their homes, or are trying to find food somewhere, trying to hook up with lost relatives and things like that, are traveling around Gaza, not really sure where the yellow line is, and when they cross it, it's a death sentence. Israel just kills them. So, according to the Palestinian news agency Wafa, at least 2 Palestinians were killed by an Israeli drone in Gaza, in an eastern neighborhood of Gaza City. A day earlier, at least 5 Palestinians were killed in the same neighborhood while inspecting their homes. The IDF claims they crossed the yellow line and posed a threat, but did not allege that they were armed. And so anybody who crosses the yellow line is a threat. Anybody who, they had these kill zones in Gaza where the Israeli military would just draw lines, never tell the Palestinians where they were, and when they walked across them, they killed them. That's the same thing that's happening here. So lots of bodies being dug out of the rubble, and a lot of Palestinians are, a low number, but still a number of Palestinians are being killed daily in Gaza. All right, I thought this was pretty interesting. I wrote this one up for the Institute yesterday. U.S.-led Military Coordination Center will oversee deliveries into Gaza. So the U.S. is establishing a command and control center outside of Gaza that will monitor aid deliveries and the ceasefire. An official speaking about the ceasefire and hostage exchange says it was rushed and details still need to be worked out. According to Fox News, a well-placed source said the U.S. is moving 200 troops into Israel to establish a multinational civil military coordination center, or CMCC, just outside of Gaza. The official said the U.S. troops would not enter the Strip. This source told the outlet that the CMCC will monitor everything going in and out of Gaza and will oversee all logistics of aid to the enclave under the deal sits under 8 trucks must be allowed into Gaza each day. On Tuesday, Israel claimed that Hamas had not returned enough body of deceased Israeli captives and threatened to cut aid deliveries into Gaza to 300 trucks each day, but they have not followed through on that threat so far. The source explained that the ceasefire and hostage exchange was negotiated at lightning speed and did not address several key issues. Two outstanding questions are what group will secure Gaza and whether Hamas will disarm. President Donald Trump is demanding that Hamas is disarmed. He threatened that if the group does not lay down its arms, we will disarm them and it will happen quickly and perhaps violently, he said. At the same time, Trump has approved of allowing Hamas to reestablish security control over Gaza. Since the ceasefire went into effect, Hamas has fought against Palestinian factions that were backed by Israel during the war, and Trump, again, has approved of this. Next up here, this one from Dave DeCamp, antiwar.com. U.S. Central Command issues warning to Hamas that contradicts President Trump. So CENTCOM on Wednesday issued a statement urging Hamas to stop executing Palestinians in Gaza, contradicting earlier comments from President Donald Trump. Hamas has carried out executions of alleged criminals and collaborators with Israel, which Trump expressed support for on Tuesday, saying that the group was taking out gang members. That's okay. It's a couple of very bad gangs, the president said. Admiral Brad Cooper, commander of CENTCOM, said that the U.S. military command was urging Hamas to immediately suspend violence and shooting innocent Palestinians in Gaza, in both Hamas-held parts of Gaza and those held by the IDF behind the Yellow Line. According to the Israeli media, Hamas has not carried out executions behind the so-called Yellow Line, the term being used for the line that the IDF troops withdrew to when the ceasefire went into effect. The Israeli military has killed several Palestinians who the IDF claimed crossed the line, but was not mentioned in Cooper's statement. So this is all very interesting, and I think this is going to try to be used as an excuse to say that Hamas is violating the ceasefire. We will see kind of how Israel weighs in on this. So Trump says Israel could return attacks in Gaza as soon as I say the word. This one from Dave DeCamp, October 15th, antiwar.com. President Trump said Wednesday that the Israeli military could resume attacks in Gaza as soon as I say the word if Hamas doesn't disarm. When asked by CNN what would happen if Hamas doesn't give up the weapons, Trump said, I think about it. Israel will return to those streets as soon as I say the word. If Israel would go in and knock the crap out of them, they do that. And look, this isn't going to get Hamas to disarm. Israel has been trying to get Hamas to disarm this way for 2 years. This is just Trump saying that if Hamas doesn't agree to disarm, Israel is going to restart the war, something that most of us saw coming. Another interesting thing is that 2 senior U.S. officials said on Wednesday that Hamas was not violating the ceasefire deal, pushing back on Israeli claims that the Palestinian group was in violation of the agreement because it did not immediately release all the bodies of the deceased Israeli captives. This is something that we've covered a lot on the show. I think it's fairly obvious that it's going to take time for Hamas to recover the bodies. Hopefully they can produce most of them, but I think this is probably going to be the first excuse that Israel uses to start to walk back its commitments to the ceasefire and hostage exchange deal. And once they start to walk back those commitments, I think they're just going to continue to do so. We saw a very similar thing happen in February and March of last year after Israel agreed to a ceasefire and hostage exchange in January. All right, so this article I wrote for the Institute on October 14th. UN. Countries have committed $70 billion to rebuild Gaza, but it could take decades to recover. So a UN official, Jaco Sillers, said that the United Nations have combined he said Canada, Europe, Arab countries, and the U.S. have combined to commit $70 billion to the rebuilding of Gaza. The task of rebuilding Gaza will be monumental, as the Israeli bombardment generated at least 55 million tons of rubble that has exploded, riddled with unexploded bombs and the bodies of killed Palestinians. Siller said it could take decades for Hamas to Gaza to recover. And I certainly think that's the case. All right, lastly up here, wanted to mention this. The U.S. government is moving towards removing sanctions on Syria, both in the United States and the international sanctions imposed by the United Nations. At the United Nations, they're specifically asking that the sanctions on Abu Mohammed al-Jolani, or what is his name? Hold up here, guys. I'm just looking for what he calls himself now. Ahmed al-Shara. So that's the new name of Abu Mohammed al-Jolani. I like using al-Jolani because that's the name he used to fight against the U.S. during the Iraq War for al-Qaeda. That's the name he used when he founded Syria's al-Qaeda affiliate. So that's the name. That's how everybody knows him as. The Ahmed al-Shara is just a part of this propaganda effort to make Jolani into some kind of respectable leader that could replace Bashar al-Assad, when really he's just a jihadist. I don't necessarily disapprove of the U.S. removing sanctions on Syria. I'm against all war, all economic wars. As Ron Paul often says, sanctions are an act of war. But to only reverse the sanctions on Syria after al-Qaeda takes control of the country is clear as in a good insight on what the U.S. true priorities are in the region. All right, everybody, that's where I'm wrapping up the show for today. Thank you all so much for tuning in. We will be back later today, 4:45 Eastern, with another episode of the Kyle Anzalone Show. Please subscribe to the channel and tune into that episode. Thanks, everyone.